don't plan to renominate myself as chair. I think that there's great energy and leadership emerging as we do the work amongst ourselves. I'd like to stay involved on the board, but
Beautiful. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Law for Black Lives webinar series. This is the summer webinar series. We're super excited to have everybody. Just for a quick kind of refresher on the technology, if you are not already on mute, please go on mute. We have a really exciting webinar ahead of us. The best way to enjoy it is normally through headphones. If you have any issue with sound or anything else, please feel free to go to the chat box and chat Law for Black Lives. Let us know any tech issues you're having or any other issues. So this is our first webinar series in our summer series. Special. This one is focused on abolition and the law. We're going to dig into what is abolition, what is its place in a legal framework, and how our lawyers and organizers across the country using abolition to further the goals of the movement and of organizers. So we're super excited to have this convo with y'all. The next webinar will be next month. It's the fourth Tuesday. That one is on lawyering with and for political prisoners in celebration of Black August, which is going to focus on how we can work better with folks on the inside to further our collective goals and to do lawyering from the inside out. And the last webinar for the summer will be on Thursday, September 25th. And that will be focused on youth movements and de-incarceration. And so how young folks across the country are leading movements to de-incarcerate, not only in this country, but also across the globe. So we're super excited to start this webinar. We have an incredible panel of folks who are lawyers and organizers who are doing work around abolition. I think abolition has been a topic of conversation and of movement for centuries. And certainly for the last few decades, it's become incredibly popular in the last few years to talk about how do we start to abolish this industrial complex. And although it's very popular in movement, I think it's the center of a lot of demands from Movement for Black Lives and Vision for Black Lives. Lawyers are often not part of that conversation. And so this webinar is focused on what abolition means in the legal practice, how lawyers can work with organizers to further that goal, and also what do we mean when we talk about abolition in a real way. So we're gonna spend most of the time together with questions from y'all. We're asking folks if you have questions or thoughts or want clarifications to please put in the chat box to everybody, any questions you have, and we'll keep track of those so when it's time for the question portion of the show, we can have those ready. We also will probably open the mics at the end for folks who have additional questions. So I'm going to quickly introduce the panelists, and then from there, each of the panelists will discuss for about 5 to 10 minutes their grounding in abolition, what it means to them and how they use it in their legal practice or organizing work, and what their vision is around abolition. At which point we'll open it up to questions from y'all to think through and begin to unpack what that means for each of us. So we have 4 incredible panelists. The first is Rachel Horsing. Rachel lives in and works in Oakland, where she fights the violence of policing and imprisonment. She is the co-founder of Critical Resistance, an incredible national grassroots organization that is dedicated to abolishing the prison industrial complex. And she's also the co-director of the Storytelling and Organizing Project, a community resource that shares stories of intervention to interpersonal harm that do not rely on policing or caging. And we also have Dami, who is currently with Civil Rights Corps and is a graduate of Rutgers University and Harvard Law School. In law school, he represented indigenous defendants in criminal hearings and tenants and eviction proceedings. He also was part of the Harvard Legal Aid Bureau, and before joining Civil Rights Corps, he was a fellow at ACLU's Racial Justice Project. Additionally, we have Allegra McLeod, who does research and teaching on areas of criminal law and procedure, immigration, international and comparative law, and political legal theory. She received a JD from Yale and a PhD from Stanford, or PhD and MA from Stanford. She has focused and taught on political theory at Stanford and served as a consulting attorney with Stanford's Immigration Rights and Criminal Defense Clinics and worked with the ACLU National Prison Project. She also has an incredible article that's at the forefront of conversations around abolition in the legal sphere, which is a dope article that everyone should download. And then we have Erica, who works at Advancement Project as a Skadden Fellow, and works around local and national movements that dismantle state violence and divest from criminal measures and invest in our communities around control and safety. Delca's previous work was supported or has supported educational and criminalization efforts, including building school-to-college pipeline programs for youth of color, conducting research that led to a local ban-the-box ordinance, revitalizing the state school funding formula to ensure more equitable and adequate funding, and a successful campaign against the ballot initiative that would have eliminated statewide affirmative action. She also organizes the Law for Black Lives, yay, which is a network of over 4,000 lawyers, law students, and legal workers. So that's our incredible, incredible panel. And I'm going to start with Rachel to really just ground us in what we mean when we talk about abolition, and what that means for her work and what that might mean for us.
Thanks, Marvin.
Everybody who's not on mute can put themselves on mute.
Yes.
Thanks, Marvin. Thanks for having me, and thanks to everybody for jumping on today. So yeah, I got asked to just talk a little bit about abolition and what we mean by that when we talk about it. And I guess the first thing I would say is that I think, what Margaret didn't say is my current work is with the Center for Political Education. And a big part of what we do is to help people learn movement lessons, to have their analysis be sharper so their work can be sharper. And I think it's really, really important in the case of abolition to be clear and precise about what we mean. I don't think it's enough to just say I'm an abolitionist. What is it you want to abolish, right? There are people out there that are interested in the abolition of sex work, which means the criminalization of people who seek sex workers, for instance. There are people who are for the abolition of substances, which means the criminalization of people who use substances of a variety. So I think it's really, really important to not presume that we know what people are talking about when they say that. I think we need to be clear about what we mean. So the other thing, I'm just going to ask one last time, if you're not on mute, if you can be on mute, that would be really, really helpful. So when I'm talking about abolition, I'm talking about abolition of the prison industrial complex. That's the kind of abolition I'm talking about. I know that there are people who are operating, now for abolition of ICE and other kinds of things. And so I think everybody should be clear in what they're talking about. And the real difference, I think, for a lot of these things is kind of what is your end game, right? So for me, the end game is the elimination of the use of surveillance, policing, imprisonment, sentencing that is used to contain and control people, and instead build up healthy, well, self-determined ways of living, working, playing together. And self-determination really is the key there for me. So that's my end game. I would love to eliminate the use of imprisonment, policing, and surveillance, but if we do that and Black people still are not self-determined, then that is not a good end goal for me. So, that's the end game as far as I see it. And it's about the elimination of institutions, systems and policies and practices that seek containment, control, death in many cases. But it is equally about articulating what we want, right? So it's equally affirmative as it is, detracting or eliminating. And it's to be really, really clear and articulate about the kinds of social relationships we want to have, the physical environments that we want to live in, the political systems that we want to live under, the economic relationships that we want to have with each other. And while all of those things aren't exactly prison industrial complex abolition, a long-term vision that thinks broadly, right? So part of our legacy comes from W.E.B. Du Bois and this concept of abolition democracy, right? So the idea that to complete the process of full abolition of enslavement, for instance, there needs to be a reckoning with the set of institutions and access to those institutions that allow formerly enslaved people to be able to participate fully in an empowered way in the social life of this country, for instance. And prison industrial complex abolition comes also from that legacy, right? So if we're imagining the elimination of these systems of containment and control, then we're equally trying to think about what are the institutions that allow, people to live more fully, more full lives all the way around. And while it comes from, this concept of abolition democracy, there's that legacy. there's a legacy that comes from the abolition of chattel slavery, although I think it's wrong and lazy to draw a direct through line from slavery to imprisonment. There are strands of that organizing, right, for the abolition of enslavement that are undercurrents of the work that we do today. But I would say also that the current prison industrial complex abolitionist movements that are worth their salt, I would say, are also infused with, you know, third worldism and a concept of kind of third world power. They're infused with feminism, third world feminism. They're infused with queer liberation, right? So they're kind of riding the currents of movements that are also really, really about full lives, full, healthy, self-determined lives for people who have been historically oppressed. The other thing I'll say about abolition is that I think it is a political ideology and praxis, and it is not a set of lifestyle choices, right? So it's not enough to be like, well, I personally don't call the cops, right? The idea of this specific political ideology and praxis is that that might be a good step, but that probably won't erode the system of imprisonment and policing such that you see its elimination, right? So if you make a choice that's politically informed and you want to animate that toward the elimination of the system, you want to get your coworkers and your friends and your family and whoever to also join you in that. If you want to join an organization, join a movement that builds the possibility of seeing that end game, then that's a different thing than kind of personal individual choices. So this is a political project, and I think it's actually really important to say that out loud and to be real about that. As I said, you know, we're interested in thinking about dismantling and eliminating institutions and practices and policies. And we're also interested in figuring out how to delegitimate and denaturalize those systems, right? Stopping short of that, I think, stops short of the true potential of what we mean when we're talking about abolishing the prison industrial complex. So, for instance, if we do things that inadvertently like shore up a different piece, so if we advocate, for instance, for the release of a certain category of imprisoned person, maybe so-called first-time nonviolent, right? But that we have to do that in such a way that it shores up the system's ability to cage and control, you know, so-called violent, long-term, you know, lifers, then we're not doing work for abolition, right? If we advocate for the elimination of the violence of policing in one area for, you know, people who identify as women, for instance, in situations of domestic harm, but we do that in such a way that it escalates the system's ability to target and capture and contain others of our family, then those are trade-offs that we're not trying to make. The kind of way that probably some of you have heard me say this before is we don't want to build up anything that we're just going to have to tear down in the future. We want to build and build and build with the constant goal of eroding and clearing space and getting in the cracks and fracturing the ability of these systems to keep themselves going. So I'm gonna just talk about a couple other things, and then I'll wrap up. In a similar vein, I think, you know, when we're talking about abolition, sometimes people will say, I'm an abolitionist, but, right? I think for me, there's no abolitionist, but, and I don't think everybody needs to be an abolitionist, right? You know, like I can have a fantasy world where everybody's on board politically and aligned and everybody's moving in the same direction. But right now, I do think that's a bit of a fantasy world. But our work, if we are abolitionists, is to make this common sense. It is to make it compelling. It's to make it clear why this is a good political ideology and praxis to follow, right? So there's not some wait until the, you know, oh, happy day moment that's going to happen if we don't put ourselves to work making the conditions for abolition to be viable. And that's why I say there's no like, I'm an abolitionist, but, right? If you are committed to a praxis of abolition, what you are doing is trying to seed the ground today to make it increasingly viable for abolition to be a possibility tomorrow. And that means, again, not just kind of making lifestyle choices, but making really clear political choices about, in many of your cases, how you lawyer or how you organize or what you're advocating for. And I think it's important to do that in a way also that's not super purist, right? So it's also not about shaming people for not having good enough politics or not being down enough or not having the exact right line. It's about making it clear, right, what it means to advocate for the eventual elimination or the today elimination, if we can do that, of imprisonment, policing, surveillance, and punitive sentencing. So we don't want to be rigid and we don't want to be alienating, but we also want to be clear. To advocate for prison industrial complex is to advocate for something specific and to have a specific end goal in mind. There's nothing magical about it. It's, not only a utopian vision. It's something that requires hard work every day and requires us to make choices about what we advocate for, what we don't advocate for. So just a couple examples: eliminating cages wherever they exist is a good step, right? So to try to prevent new prisons and jails and detention centers from being built, to close prisons and jails and detention centers whenever we can, to prevent the system from making a case that it is better for people locked in cages to have more cages or to have better cages, right? We all know that it is always better to live a life outside of a cage. And so the trick for us then as abolitionists is to try to figure out how to articulate remedies that don't involve more cages. So that's like one example. Another example is trying to starve the system of the resources that it uses to survive, right? So it's not quite as simple to me as just invest, divest, right? I think that's like a catchy slogan and a really good starter. But what is the shift material? What are we taking resources from? What are we starving? And what are we feeding? And being very specific about not feeding something that we're just gonna have to starve later, yeah? And then, a third example is decoupling anti-violence work from criminalization work, right? So, most of us know that our safety is not increased by the presence of law enforcement or the threat of containment and control, right? Those might be short-term fixes. And I'll be honest, I think there are some times when like that idea gives us a little bit of relief. So again, it's not to shame anybody into saying you should never call the cops or anything like that. But we know that's not a good long-term fix because ultimately that increases the violence in our communities, that shrinks the kinds of expansive thinking that we can do around other kinds of remedies, and it really limits the tools that we have at our disposal if we keep going back to punishment, containment, control every single time, and we use those remedies as if they will work for everything. So I'm gonna leave it there, but I think the key things are like not a lifestyle choice, very specific, be specific about what it is, that it is practical, and that we have to make the conditions if we want an abolitionist future. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rachel, for that. And for folks who have questions, we're encouraging folks to put it in the chat box and we'll come back to it. Rachel has to hop a little bit early, so we're going to try and get Rachel's questions in first. But thank you so much, Rachel. And also want to encourage everyone to both Google Rachel for her incredible and prolific writing around abolition, and also critical resistance, which has been really, has led the way around thinking around abolition. So Google both, it will serve you well. So I'm going to go next to Allegra, who's our next speaker, who's an incredible thinker around the intersection of abolition and the law, and is going to share with us a bit about her own evolution towards abolition and kind of the place of the law in abolition.
Thank you so much, Mar, for organizing this. Thank you, Rachel, and my other co-panelists for your brilliant and important work. And many thanks to all of you in the audience for being with us. I write and teach about abolition in a law school, and I come to this work as someone trained in law and political theory. And perhaps for these reasons, Mar asked that I address in my remarks the relationship between law and abolition specifically. So what is the relationship between abolition and the law? I understand abolition in line with much of what Rachel has already so powerfully described as both a negative project of dismantling and a positive project of world building. In other words, abolition is both about resistance, critique, dismantling of cages, surveillance, subordination, and at one and the same time, abolition is a project of building the world we want to live in. What Angela Davis, as Rachel calls our attention to following W.E.B. Du Bois, has described in terms of abolition democracy. And law is implicated both in the negative project of abolition that calls for unmasking law's violence, and in the positive project of creating a more just and peaceful world, that is in realizing abolition democracy. I also understand the contemporary project of abolition is connected to the historical struggles against slavery, against imperialism, and its legacies and more recent practices of racial capitalism, against immigration enforcement and border fortification. And of course, law has been and remains at the heart of these systems of oppression, and I'll suggest that it may also play some small part in their dismantling. So to begin, law is directly complicit in and responsible for the violence of policing, for brutality in prisons and jails, and in ways that are seldom directly acknowledged. More specifically, US constitutional and statutory law is seeped in the blood of people murdered by police, in the suffering of people held behind bars, in the rapes of human beings in prison and immigration detention, and in the caging of hundreds of thousands of people in tombs, euphemistically referred to as administrative segregation. So think of Sandra Bland, Philando Castile, Eric Garner. The US Supreme Court, in a case called Atwater v. City of Lago Vista, has condoned under the Constitution a full custodial arrest of a young woman for a traffic violation, effectively rendering this body of constitutional law complicit in the killing of Sandra Bland. In Scott v. Harris, the Supreme Court approved the police use of deadly force, that is, force that could kill, even when police could readily have taken another course without any risk to the officers or others. So through this body of purportedly rights protective constitutional doctrine, the law itself is in significant part responsible for the murders of Philando Castile, Eric Garner, and others. US statutory law is also implicated through and through in the violence and dehumanization unfolding in US prisons. As we speak, prisoners across the US are organizing a mass strike and protest to begin next month, calling for an end to prison slavery, to the grotesque injustice of their conditions of confinement. And they're organizing in part around a package of 1996 legislation supported by the Clinton administration, including the Prison Litigation Reform Act and the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, or AEDPA. And they view these statutes as in part responsible for how hundreds of human beings, including the incarcerated organizers, have been consigned to live their lives in squalid cages. Local legal agreements are also a target of abolitionist organizing. Those activists who called in recent months for the abolition of ICE, who are occupying the areas outside of immigration detention centers from Florida to the Northwest, identify the local legal agreements between police, jail, and federal immigration enforcement as in part the target of their abolitionist efforts. And of course, it's the law that's rendered certain conduct criminal, punishable by caging, conduct like petty theft, possession and sale of certain narcotics, crimes of poverty and addiction. And it's the law, too, that intergenerational wealth transfers that preserve the dispossession wrought by slavery, by Jim Crow, by residential and school segregation, among other forms of racial violence. So an important part of the work of abolition for those trained in law is to expose these practices, to bring to bear a ruthless critique of law's complicity in violence and inequality, and to illuminate how the law works in its details to effect injustice, dispossession, dehumanization. Part of the work of in connection with law is also to expose incessantly and everywhere how law perpetuates the spectacular violence on display in police killings, in the gross dehumanization ongoing in prisons and jails, but also how law is complicit in those conditions of slow death, in the social and economic inequalities that characterize the difference in life chances between those who inherit the spoils of racial dispossession and those who die behind bars. Law may be used, I think, in critical ways to counter some of this violence by, say, for example, freeing people who are confined in prison and jails. Abolition may be furthered, too, by acting in solidarity and in support of activists, organizers, community members who put their bodies on the line and resisting ICE and resisting local police departments. But this critical defensive and obstructionist work, which is carried out in part through law, while crucially important to those it helps, doesn't by itself serve to realize abolition democracy. Abolition democracy requires instead, I think, that we envision justice in new terms, that we develop new ways of preventing and realizing, redressing violence, that we oppose policing and imprisonment in connection with efforts to realize greater social and economic equality. And law may play some small part too in these efforts, I think. And I'd like to close my remarks by offering just a few examples of how those sorts of efforts have taken shape. So in Chicago, a corrupt, vicious, and brutal white police commander named John Burge presided over a regime of torture of people arrested and in custody in Chicago for many years. Those under Burge's control were beaten, they were suffocated with their heads held in plastic bags, electric shocks applied to their genitals, all to extract false confessions. But the movement to seek justice in the aftermath of this violence focused not exclusively or primarily on punishing John Burge, though his conduct was condemned and he was roundly criticized and punished for these acts. But activists like the amazing abolitionist organizer and thinker Miriam Kaba, organizers in the community, torture survivors, and some lawyers pushed the Chicago City Council and the city of Chicago to launch a torture memorial project to commemorate some of these egregious violations that have been perpetrated in the city there. They won a center and resources to support mental health, medical, and other services for survivors of police trauma. And they pushed in the legislation to change the Chicago public school curriculum across the board for all public school students, such that they would learn about slavery, about colonialism, and about police torture. And I think this is one example of what reimagining justice might look like. In DC, activists associated with Black Lives Matter successfully opposed the mayor's draconian proposed criminal legislation a couple years ago, but they tied their opposition to a groundswell of organizing for affordable housing, for a living wage, and for community land trusts, which are vehicles that can be used to fight gentrification and dispossession of lower income residents, effectively redistributing the benefits of rising property values. In Richmond, California, organizers associated with an organization called Advance Peace are working to end gun violence, and some of them say they're working to put the police out of business by preventing gun violence before it occurs. So some of these folks work with young people that are most at risk of killing and of being killed, giving these folks the equivalent of a postgraduate fellowship, life support, travel opportunities, and a stipend conditioned only on them being committed to the program. So in devising forms of self-help like these, designing alternatives to 911 as other organizers have done, or by establishing restorative alternatives in the aftermath of interpersonal violence, activists are beginning to create a world without prisons and police, shrinking the role of criminal law in our lives. And in the process, I think we become just a little bit more able to imagine what abolition democracy might consist of. In her book, Undoing Border Imperialism, the writer, thinker, organizer, and abolitionist Harsha Walia describes these sorts of small-scale projects in terms of, that is, as ways to figure the sort of changed world that we want to live in. And I'll close with this thought. Ultimately, the question of what justice might look like without prisons and police should remain open, I think. But these are attempts, organizing and ongoing in communities around the country, to begin to prefigure, to envision, and to enact abolition democracy.
Thank you so much, Allegra, for that grounding. And again, Allegra writes incredible articles around this. She has one in UCLA's law review called Prison Abolition and Grounded Justice, which we'll have on our website. But really appreciate the kind of legal grounding of that. I want to pass it to Derica, who both approaches abolition from a legal and an organizing standpoint, to kind of talk about both the whole own evolution, but also some of the tensions that are inherent in abolition. Also going to ask if you are not on mute, but you are just listening, to please go on mute for us. There'll be a time at the end to ask questions as well, but if you have questions in the meantime, go ahead and chat them to us and we will try and get them answered. Go ahead, Derica.
Okay, all right, hello everyone. Hello to Rachel, Allegra, Mar, and Dami. This is so amazing. I'm always excited to talk about abolition. So Mar asked me, I think everyone, 3 questions. You know, what does abolition mean to me? How do I become an abolitionist, and how do I practice it? So I actually became I don't know if I became an abolitionist in Ferguson. I think that when we were in the streets protesting, there was this really popular chant that was indict, convict, send those killer cops to jail. The whole damn system is guilty as hell. I see you bouncing, Mara. Yeah, like when people would chant that chant, I was just really caught off guard because there's so much packed in those two lines, right? There's a call for legal accountability, to indict, convict, and send the killer cop to jail, while also acknowledging that the entire system is guilty. So there was this reliance on the criminal legal system to do what it was supposed to do while also acknowledging its failures. And sometimes when people talk about the movement for Black Lives or the Black Lives Matter movement as an abolitionist movement, I think about those chants and I think about, the struggle, my own personal struggle coming to abolitionism, and just learning that it is in those failures that there's these opportunities to think more radically about organizing and about the law. And so actually similar to what Allegra pointed out in the way that, statutory law and constitutional law are implicated in furthering police violence, I had to make a decision. After every police killing, there was not an arrest. If there was an arrest, there wasn't an indictment. If there was an indictment, there wasn't a conviction. And we saw even in New York, where there was a conviction, we have a prosecutor who asked the judge for no jail time because this is a mistake. This is, Officer Peter Liang's trial for the murder of Akai Gurley. So even when you do get a conviction, you get the prosecutor asks for no jail time. And so I figured, very simple logic that one of two things are happening. Either police officers are literally getting away with murder, they're killing people and just walking away, or we can believe the courts when they say that the police officers are behaving constitutionally. And when I started to believe the courts, becoming an abolitionist was so much easier. Because it's the fight to say that the court is wrong, the law is wrong, the police officers are wrong. It's a much harder uphill battle because you're always going to lose because of the way that racism is entrenched into the law. But if you simply just believe the court that what the officer did was completely constitutional, then the answer is much more simple to me. But we just don't need police. We don't need prisons. If we believe you, if we believe that it's legal to kill someone who is trespassing in the middle of a Ferguson street. If we take these things to be true, then I think that we all should believe the courts. And in believing the courts, I was just drawn to who was, also thinking about the law in these terms. And that's how I got introduced to critical resistance. Being around radical attorneys like Mar and Porvy Shaw, Amanda Alexander, all the folks in Law for Black Lives, who were having really, really complicated discussions because you have organizers who would turn to us whenever something went down. And it was like, how did this happen? How did this happen? And then us trying to formulate some sort of response to articulate how we can approach it, through the law. And then there is no explanation for it. It happens because the law makes sure it happens because it's going to protect people who are in the closest proximity to power. And through that work, I just was fortunate to meet people who were really, really, really radical. And then we just started reading and doing political education and debating and having really, really intense debates. And we also found, in those spaces that some of the conversations that we were having, we thought that they were really, really new. What's going to happen to people who are, the people who are most vulnerable to violence? What's going to happen to people who are domestic violence, survivors, or people who are likely to, end up, getting shot or stabbed, and to break into the literature, to break into some of these debates. And you see that this debate has been happening for 20 years. It's been happening literally for 20 years. It's affirming to know that the thoughts of how we can reduce and shrink, and I like Rachel's term, starve, how we can starve the system of its resources by also thinking and reimagining ways to make people less violent. So why do people kill people? We have answers to these questions. Why do people commit sexual violence? We have answers to these questions. And we can determine if we want a society that has less rapists versus having a society where people who commit rape or sexual assault end up in a cage where they're going to continue to be sexually assaulted or commit sexual assault. We don't have to reproduce the logics of the state. Instead, we can just work towards, a society where people are whole, people are empowered, and people are organizing to self-determination. And so the work that I do now with Advancement Project, we mostly try to help organizers build campaigns that they self-determine. And two of the partners that we work with in St. Louis, one is the Ferguson Collaborative and the other one is the St. Louis Action Council. The Ferguson Collaborative, they are the community group that is doing the most amount of work around the consent decree. Now, a consent decree is this agreement between the Department of Justice and the city of Ferguson, where the police department has to abide by all of these changes that they agreed upon before a federal court. And whenever there's, an issue, whenever there is an attempt to hold, the Ferguson Police Department accountable, the means to do that is this consent decree. So this community group, mostly Ferguson residents, diverse group of people, they're working to figure out how can we, make the most of this particular consent decree to get what we need. Because at the end of the day, once the Department of Justice leaves, then we're going to have to figure out how to live with Ferguson and PD. Now, in terms of abolition, you wouldn't think that a consent decree is probably the most radical thing that you can come up with. There's not going to be a consent decree to eliminate the Ferguson Police Department. I mean, a girl can dream, but I don't think that's going to be the case. But what we can do within the consent decree and what we're experimenting with in Ferguson is, okay, well, within this consent decree, this is a way that we can decriminalize a lot of the actions that the police would use to stop people on the street. So how can we push the city to make sure that all of these areas are decriminalized? In the consent decree, there's an opportunity to create, a municipal code. So how can we have, how can we help these organizers draft progressive ordinances like ban the box or, things that protect people in the city so they don't have to, call the police. There could be a crisis response team or someone else who's better trained to handle folks who are in crisis instead of someone who shows up with a gun. So we try to help them think through progressive ordinances that they can use to put into the municipal code. And again, that's an opportunity to have for this consent decree. One campaign that we're helping the Ferguson Collaborative with is around driver's license reinstatement. And so there are all these people in Ferguson that as a result of their of Ferguson Police Department's practices, their licenses have been suspended, which means they have to pay a reinstatement fee. It could have implications for them voting because if your license is suspended, you may not be able to vote. If you have a warrant or your license has been suspended because FPD was racist, and you have to report that to your insurance company, your insurance rates can increase. So there's all these implications of what this driver's license and warrants issue can have for the city. And so what this community is trying to do is organize to get the city to pay, I don't want to call it reparations yet, because we're still debating on what sort of language we want to use to describe how the city needs to pay for all of the ways that this particular group has been harmed. But that's a campaign that's not something like, how can we just, clear the warrants? Well, we can't clear the warrants, but we need more because people have lost more as a result of the Ferguson Police Department. So that's an example of one campaign. A second campaign that St. Louis Action Council is doing, and Advancement Project is now trying to figure out how we can be best supportive, is closing a city jail in St. Louis. So St. Louis Action Council has this incredible campaign, along with a coalition of people, to close the workhouse in St. Louis. And not only that, they're working with, our City Defenders, which is this other incredible legal organization in St. Louis, to not only stop, not only to close the workhouse, but to prevent another jail being opened in its place. Because what ends up happening is that when folks are organizing campaigns around jails, we'll see that the city will concede and say, okay, this jail is in terrible shape. Well, now let's build a brand new jail so we can house all these new people. And I think our city defenders and, with this coalition, with St. Louis Action Council, we're trying to figure out a way to say, okay, wait a minute, we can stop people from going to jail if we met their needs, right? So how can we meet their needs, prevent harm, prevent violence, so we then don't have to create funds or create a new pool of funds to build another system that cages people. So those are two new campaigns that I think are, really, really excited. And they are in the spirit of a lot of the work that people are now experiencing, and they're taking on in different parts of the country. And again, it's thanks to the people who are like Rachel, like Ruthie Wilson-Gilmore, like Angela Davis, like all these people who have, again, for the last 20, 25 years have really put abolition on the table, and it's forcing us to have a conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Derica, as always, for being on point and for those incredibly tangible examples, which I think are super helpful as we process what this might look like. So next we have Dami to speak a bit about, Dami does a lot of litigation work, so talk a bit about what abolition, and do some of this, what abolition means inside of litigation and how that plays out. And again, around grounding us all in kind of your own journey to abolition. So take it away, Dami.
Thank you very much, Mara Bray, for having me. Thank you all for participating and listening and indulging. Thank you, Rachel and Allegra, as co-panelists. And it's really great that I'm sitting next to Derica, because Derica is like a good friend of mine and someone I have a lot of these conversations with, and someone who's informed a lot of my thinking on these issues over the years. I think I've informed her thinking on issues as well. So I'll take the same kind of questions. First, like, how did I become an abolitionist? Then I'll tell you a little bit about our work, the limitations of our work. And I hope there's like a lot of law students out here listening to this, because I kind of like frame this, as my perspective of being a recent law student to becoming like a very young lawyer. I'm only in my second year of legal practice. I became an abolitionist. I went to law school to be, I thought I was gonna be a public defender, or to be a public defender to like do something to dismantle the criminal system. I interned at a public defender office before law school and during law school. And I like the framing, Allegra's framing of like having a constructive versus a deconstructive project. My thought was just like public defender is like this deconstructive project in this path, and you go and you kind of fuck shit up. You get people out of jail who you can get out, and then, you move right along. But there was something about being in jail and talking to people every day and seeing people going through that process that makes you think that like, oh, there must be a constructive project out there. There must be something to do to ensure that no one else or no one ever has to go through this like violent and brutal and dehumanizing process. And from that thought, that's what said like, no one should ever be in prison. No one should be in jail. No one should be behind cages. I think it's simple and not even a controversial thing to say that like no one should be behind cages. And then maybe there's a question of like, what do you do about, people who are causing harm, et cetera? And like, how do you ensure people's needs are met so they don't cause harm to others interpersonally or what have you? What I do is I work at an organization called Civil Rights Corps, and I think we try or we have an abolitionist framing, or in the way we think about our work. We in some sense tries to put some like sensitivity or resensitize people to just the like massive harms of the criminal system. What that means is we go around the country and we sit in court, we watch how jurisdictions treat pre-trial, people who are arrested and going through the pre-trial process. And what we focus on usually or mostly is the issue of bail and wealth-based detention. It seems like a very technical issue, but it like actually devastates people's lives. In jurisdictions or places, people live all over the country and in courts all over the country. Someone gets arrested, there is just like an arbitrary amount of bail that's slapped on them, usually based on the alleged crime they committed. And if they can pay that amount of money, if they can literally just give the sheriff or the court somehow like cash, hard cash, they get out of jail. If they can't, they stay in jail. for a week, months, like, it varies. And what that means is, you were just minding your business, doing something, you had a family, you had a job, you had to pick up your kids from after school, you had to see your mom in the hospital, you had to do X, Y, and Z. But because of this intervention that like fucks you and like means you have to be in cages, you cannot go do those things for X amount of days. And that kind of disruption shouldn't happen to anyone. And we say, like, if it happens, like, we must take it very, 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 very seriously as like a moral matter, but also as a legal matter. And we, the Constitution also says we should take it very seriously. And that's the kind of arguments we raise in court. So, I mean, the real question is like, how do we then, take this framing and this idea of abolition and like, put it into legal briefs in federal courts in places around the country where like people may be resistant to the idea of like actually giving people due process of the law, or like that the people who society has deemed the least desirable, like should actually have a right to like fight their case or to like litigate their case. And the way we do that, I think a lot of people have mentioned like increasing the cost of caging somebody. We may be a little bit agnostic of the cost, but I think what we say is like, before anyone ever has to spend a night in jail, 2 nights in jail, they must be entitled to like a hearing. They must have an attorney. You must determine whether or not they are at risk of flight or dangerous and all these things. And as Erica said about the consent decree, that is not radical on its face. And I think it concedes a lot. But what it does do is it tells courts and it tells the public that we should take this issue incredibly seriously. And I think at the end of the day, it actually just means that like a lot of people are spending less time in jail or no time in jail than otherwise. We've had cases in jurisdictions where over like, a few months span, the pretrial detention population has gone down by like thousands of people because, and every time you tell someone or you fix or formulate yourself to sue a county or jurisdiction, they take a look at their system and they just realize, oh, there's so many people that's spending a night in jail that shouldn't be spending a night in jail, and they'll make immediate corrections. I think the last thing we want to do, and I think what we take very serious as an organization is like using our litigation to like create space. And that is, I think one and most importantly is we think about it as creating space for individuals, people who are arrested and being processed. We want to create space for them to like not only litigate their case, but to say like, but in their personal lives, as people, we want to see every individual that like is a class member or is a plaintiff as an individual. Like they should, they are full human beings, and that, but also I think another thing that we take very seriously is like creating space for movements and folks who are like in the places we're working in, who are thinking about abolition, who are thinking about non-carceral alternatives, to use our work as, some kind of choke point or leverage point for their organizing and for that movement work to go forward. And in that same vein, I think I, as a law student, as like a lawyer, think a lot about the limitations of civil rights litigation. But I think the one great limitation of this work is there are a lot of lawyers and lawyering and litigation takes up a lot of space. And what that means is judges, prosecutors would rather talk to lawyers from DC or New York, or even like local lawyers, than talk to like community members who have the same grievances. And that's bad, because like when we're thinking about what we want the ideal system to look like, or what we want the reform even to look like, it shouldn't be coming from the mouths of lawyers or like people who are not living in the places. I'm working on a case in Dallas. I don't live in Dallas. I've actually never been to Dallas. I will be there soon. But like, I shouldn't be the one dictating what's happening to folks in Dallas. We're just the ones saying that like, oh, this is a right that people are entitled to. And then, in the idea of self-determination, though that's abstract and vague, the people who should determine how their system looks are the people who are affected directly by the system. And so what we can do as like lawyers who are hip to that is to say like, oh, we are going to play our role and we'll use this work as a way to bring other people into the fold, or like we'll just be more chill. We'll step back when the real work has to be done, or the work that's beyond just litigation. I think another limitation of, and the reason why I think that is so important as a practical matter is that we know adjudication and civil rights litigation has just distinct limitations. Insofar as we could get the best ruling in the Supreme Court tomorrow, as you know, there were great rulings on criminal justice, criminal legal issues and civil and criminal procedure issues in the 60s and 70s. And that doesn't mean less people will be in jail the next day or the next year or 10 years from now or 20 years from now. Because like, it's very easy for like policymakers, legislators to like just increase sanctions and increase the cost of fighting your cases, which leads to plea deals, et cetera. And so in that vein, we know the right on paper is not enough. And what will actually ensure that like this work, this like real important work of abolition and this work of like people not being in cages is the like civil society and the work that comes in front of the litigation or in conjunction with the litigation. And so that's the way I think as an organization, we think about the work we do and we think about civil rights litigation. And I will stop there.
Yes. Thank y'all so much just for the brilliance. I want to just really quickly kind of say back some of the things that I heard that really moved and inspired me. And then I want to invite folks to ask questions. Rachel has to leave in about 9 minutes. So if you have a question for Rachel specifically, please chat it so we can get her to answer it before she has to go. But I want to name a few things. I think, for me at least, the idea of abolition in a legal context was never introduced in law school. It was so far from kind of the canon of what my law school taught that I kind of had to figure out and weave together organizing thoughts and other thoughts to have a kind of idea of what abolition and the law meant together. So I want to name, first of all, the idea of radical keeps coming up. And I often think of Ella Baker when we talk about radical as grasping at the roots of things. And so not just treating symptoms, not talking about, as Rachel said, this kind of lazy correlation between anti-violence and public safety, right? Like naming that actually what keeps us safe is not necessarily cages or control or cops or surveillance, but instead is often about how we treat each other as humans. I also want to name this idea of imagining a different world. I think I often also say that law school was a constant attack on my imagination, on what was possible, right? And so encouraging folks to think about, and to Dami's point, to think about not just the world we live in and to accept impossibilities as impossibilities because they're presented as such, but instead to ask questions about what we want for our people, our communities, for ourselves when we've been injured and harmed, what actually makes us whole. And so this idea of cultivating an imagination beyond what currently is, I think is super important. I also want to name this idea of wholeness, that over and over again we talk about what does it mean to actually treat people as human beings. And I think there's a number of folks who are in our network who talk about their experience inside of prisons, inside of cages, as one of a constant attack on their humanity, right? And so everything from how you have to line up, to strip searches, to numbers you are given instead of names, like all the ways in which our system intentionally dehumanizes our people. And what does it mean to name human, like our ability to maintain our dignity and humanity as key to any type of system that deals with accountability in a real way. And then also this idea, I think, of self-determination, which Rachel brought up, of what does that mean for our people and our communities, and how do we self-determine not just the current moment, but also the future we want to imagine. So just wanted to surface some of those because I know for me have been common themes throughout this conversation that feel really important as we think about imagining an abolitionist future. I also want to name that we didn't do a webinar on abolition because we thought everyone was an abolitionist. We know that lots of folks we work with love, respect, grow from, in fact, have different views. And I think at Law for Black Lives, we want to cultivate conversations around challenging what it is that many of us take as a given. And so really want this to be a space to present different ideas, to debate them intentionally, and to interrogate towards political clarity, things that perhaps weren't even available as options as we've moved through our legal and other journeys. So with that said, want to open it up really quickly to any questions. Folks can either chat it or unmute themselves to ask those questions. I would love to hear people's thoughts, responses, and then questions, especially for Rachel, who has to hop soon. If folks don't have questions, I have questions, but want to give folks a chance. Go ahead, Deoka.
Rachel, I'm just curious about what you think about the phrase mass incarceration.
Derek.
Smiling, so I don't know.
I have complicated feelings about it, I think. You know, on the one hand, in the kind of most literal sense, you know, it raises a question for me of like, at what threshold does something become mass, right? What is the limit at which suddenly this is a crisis where it wasn't one person ago? And I think to my mind, like, one person living in a cage is a sufficient crisis, right? Then at the same time, it's, you know, and I should give a shout to my co-director, Isaac, who's sitting across from me here, who challenges me on this. It's a phrasing, you know, it's phrasing that makes sense to people and that people use, right? I prefer to use prison industrial complex in part because I think it does the work of showing the relationships. I think it does the work of showing, you know, the kind of scale and scope better than a phrase like mass incarceration. But at the same time, it's been really, really abused, you know, by people who use it to talk only about or primarily about privatization, which it is not meant to do, which it does not suggest, right? They see industrial and immediately they go to privatization when we all know that, you know, private imprisonment in the United States of America is less than 10% of all imprisonment that we're talking about. That's not detention, right? So, you know, I want people to use language that makes sense to them. I like when we can share terms because I think it's easier to have a real substantive conversation about what we actually mean when our language is similar. But if we can get enough, you know, meaning from talking to each other across that, I think I generally know what people are talking about. Then, you know, I'm not tripping.
Dope. So Rachel, you have 2 more questions in 2 minutes. So one is around starving the system and what you mean by that. And the other one, I think this is for everyone, so Rachel, you can touch on it before you leave and we'll pass it on, is how do we engage folks who say they're sympathetic, but then say, but how about those horrible people who did this one thing? And what's kind of a quick answer that would get us there? I'm sorry Miriam isn't on the phone to give the like, answer, but.
Yeah, but you know what? I actually disagree with Miriam's response. I think we got to take it seriously. I don't think we can say we're not going to answer that question anymore. I think that that's not, I have a feeling that, you know, she is somebody who I love and respect, you know, intensely. And I think that that's short-sighted if we're trying to win people over to prison industrial complex abolition. So in terms of starving, I mean, starving it wholeheartedly, right? So that might be financial. That might be like, we want to cut, you know, the vast majority of, you know, policing budgets in the United States of America, for instance, take more than, you know, around 50% of the general fund of most major cities. And so that's a place to start drawing resources away, right? Financial resources, for instance, to say the kind of priority that we put in where we put our money as a municipality, as a state, as a country, says a lot about kind of where our priorities are socially, politically, right? So I think that's one of the arguments for saying, cut these budgets down, right? To kind of make the budget reflect what our actual social political priorities are. But I don't only mean financial. I mean physical things. So if we starve, you know, prisons of cages, they can lock fewer people up. If we starve law enforcement agencies of drones and tanks and, you know, all the extra toys, military toys that they get, then, you know, they can't militarize their policing in the same way, right? If we starve them of the expansiveness that they have in dealing with people on the street, you're not allowed to touch so-and-so, you're not allowed to be in such and such place, right? That curtails the kind of range that they have. So I mean literally in every single place where we can take things away from what animates the prison industrial complex, whether that's people or money or physical things or policies or practices, I want it all starved. I want it all taken away. And then I want to figure out what we want to feed. So that's one thing. The harmful people question, I'm sure lots of people will have good answers to. I'll say one thing about that before I leave out, which is, I think the simple, quick question is that we know that the prison industrial complex does not address harm. It increases harm. I think that is the most simple and straightforward thing to say. I also think it's very, very important, and this is what I was getting at earlier, I don't think we can be flip about this question. I think it's wrong to presume that we have to have a full blueprint. We have to know have an answer for every possible thing that might happen to anybody, because it's true that the prison industrial complex has an answer, but it's always the wrong answer, right? So I don't think we're looking to replicate or create a shadow system. I think what we're looking to do is what Derica was talking about, which is to deal with the here and now, right? How do we reduce the harm that people are facing here and now? But also, how are we transforming our relationships? I think you were exactly right, Derica. Like, we know why people kill each other, right? Like, we know why people do sexual harm to each other. And it's taking very, very seriously what those dynamics are, what the pressures are, what the tools are that allow those things to move forward, and disrupting those relationships, taking away those tools, doing that kind of stuff that transforms our conditions, our social conditions, our physical conditions. And I don't mean to say that people shouldn't face consequences. I am not somebody who thinks that, abolition means like everything's cool. Anything you want to do to somebody is cool. I don't think that at all. The survivor of sexual harm, and I want there to be consequences for people who do sexual harm to people. I don't think putting somebody in a cage is the kind of consequence that remedies that situation. I don't think it really offers people an opportunity to transform their behavior. And I don't think it does anything to shift the conditions. If anything, it reinforces all of those things, right? So what I want is somebody to have to be held closer. And that's uncomfortable for us, right? That's like deeply uncomfortable for us. But I think the idea of holding people who do harm more close in our communities, where they can be held accountable, where they do have to face the aftermath of what they've done. And this happens all over the world. This is not like something that I made up. This is actually common practice in most places in the world, where you have to kind of face to face with your community, where your community sets some terms for what is a decent remedy, right? And I'm not necessarily talking about restorative justice the way that we understand that now, because that's become so co-opted by the system itself. But I do mean, something that actually looks at some of those, roots, like you were saying, Marbury, around like the kind of Ella Baker sense of that, right? Of like digging deep to kind of what things spring from and figuring out how to transform those things. So the fast answer is cages, cops are always going to do more harm than good, right? And we need to take very, very seriously when real things happen, right? Not the fear mongering that we get fed, but the actual real harm that happens between people, and we have to figure out how to remedy that.
Rachel, thank you so much. We really appreciate it.
Bye, thank you so much for having me. I'm sorry I got to leave out early, but I'm really grateful to have been part of the conversation.
I always appreciate you so much. Thank you, Rachel. So we have about 15 more minutes together. I want to first, if other folks haven't answered this question around kind of what do we say to folks who are sympathetic but have this question around what do we do with folks who cause harm, I want to invite Allegra, Dami, or Derica to answer that question. And then we'll go, I think Ray has his hand up for a quick question from Ray. And then if other folks have questions, please chat them. But go ahead, Dami, Derica, Allegra.
My answer would be to ask Derica. So.
That's not an answer. Oh, okay. So I quickly tried to think a way to say it when I gave my short presentation, which was, we need to figure out why people kill people. And so when I first told my mom about abolition, the first thing she said was, what about the murderers? What about the rapists? say, well, Mom, why do people murder people? And so what ended up happening is that we had a conversation about, well, people are tied to under economies because they're forced out of formal economies. And when they're driven out, they're connected to, there's violence because you're seeking a way to protect yourself because you're vulnerable, you're in this group. There are people who also kill people or murder people because of toxic masculinity and domestic violence. So why is there toxic masculinity? Well, it's not something that you're just born with, it's something you're socialized into. Why do people kill people? Well, homophobia and transphobia. People aren't born homophobic and transphobic. So there's ways that we can, change the way we teach our kids, talk to people that can undo that work. Why do people kill people? Racism, racial hatred, animus. We just saw what happened at the BART station. I haven't been following the story super closely, but I saw a couple of headlines. I think the person who killed the 18-year-old woman, Nia Wilson, was caught. But we explore deeply about why people kill people. I would imagine that we come across a much smaller population of people who are, killing people because they are mentally ill or sick, which is often the fallback reason of like, oh, that person's just crazy, right? We actually know that people who suffer mental illness or health issues are more likely to be a victim of violence than a perpetrator. But there are all these social reasons that actually contribute to the murder rate that we just chalk up as that's a bad kid, that's a bad person, up to no good, or crazy. But if we aren't willing to engage in those sorts of conversations because they may take too long or they're not serious, then we're going to continue to have a practice of folks killing people. Why do people commit sexual assault? Well, I think part of it is that because we don't have serious conversations about sex and desire, right? So it's even beyond consent. Like we don't even have the good conversations about good sex and good desire. So then conversations about consent aren't like serious. Then there's conversations that need to be had, around power dynamics. All these things are teachable and learnable, but without the commitment to engage in them, without that sort of popular and political education, then it's just gonna seem hands off. And so that's why I try to think of the work that, Erica Ford is doing in New York, in East New York. Well, we know people are killing people because they're a part of, this under economy and they have to figure out how to protect themselves because they're not safe from police and they may not be safe for people in their neighborhoods. Well, we can figure out how to get people connected to a formal economy. We can figure out how to get people employed. We can figure out how to get people access to health. We can figure out how to get people access to positive places so they can't, they don't have to bottle up what they're experiencing towards their boss and then take them home and, take out their children later. There's all these sorts of ways that I think people are experimenting with creating safe, positive, healthy spaces. And what we've seen in East New York, for example, is a drastic reduction in the amount of violence in that community. And so I think there are actual examples we can look to with the what about the murderers and what about the rapist question.
Thank you so much, Deoka. Aleko, do you have any thoughts or that feels right? Oh, you're on mute. No. Oh, you're back on mute. I'm sorry. I unmuted you and then you unmuted you. So I would not. There you go.
Can you hear me? Okay. So I think all of those thoughts are really important parts of any response. I also think it's important to, as I think Rachel was suggesting, reconceptualize who the murderers and the rapists are in some degree as well. So I think that we have a conception of murders in terms of particular kinds of interpersonal violence in our cities, but we also need to think about murder in terms of war making, in terms of imperial adventures, in terms of pollution, and the kinds of slow death that I was trying to call our attention to as well, which isn't to avoid the question. I think the question is an important one, but really to take it seriously is to look at forms of interpersonal violence that go more broadly than our conventional conception of it. I also think when you think about rape and you think about sexual harm, the statistics about how much of sexual violence, child abuse, rape of various forms are reported to police is important to bear in mind. So the vast majority of rapes go unreported, of those that are reported, the vast majority are not investigated. And I think that says something both about the disinterest and incompetence of the criminal legal process in responding to rape, and also something about the ways in which that process doesn't meet the needs of survivors in many instances. So I think those are important things to bear in mind as well.
I want to thank you so much for that. Like, I feel like there's been a number of recent studies around how much our current system doesn't serve victims or survivors in any kind of way. And so folks who have survived violence don't actually have resolution as a result of the criminal legal system or cages, right? And so it isn't actually for them or for us. That feels important to say. I've lost my voice. I think, Ray, you had a question. Are you off of mute? Oh, we can't hear you, Ray. So we can't hear you, but I can repeat the question. Nope, still can't hear you. So the question you had was around the civil consequences or civil kind of space of abolition. Is that right? Oh, no, we can't hear you. Do you want to type the question again? For some reason, we can't hear you at all. So his question was, how about the civil side? When we talk about deprivations of civil and constitutional rights under Title 18, being denied and deprived equal protection and due process in federal court of law, but not only federal court of law. So then the question is, like, what does abolition look like in a civil context, if at all? Is that right, Ray? Thumbs up if that's on the, okay, beautiful. Do you folks have thoughts about kind of what are the civil parameters and like kind of mechanisms around trying to accomplish abolition outside of the criminal legal spiel?
I can just say, can you hear me? This is Allegra. I can just say briefly, I'm not sure I completely understand all the different parameters of the question, but I think one thing that's important to bear in mind is that the criminal process, prisons have come to stand in as a one-size-fits-all solution to a whole range of social, economic, and political problems. And when we think in terms of abolition, we're insisting upon stepping outside of that frame and trying to think about ways to address mental health crises, homicide, sexual assault, poverty, lack of affordable housing, and so on. And many of the solutions to those problems will come from areas of law ranging from property law to environmental law to education law, and of course all these spheres of organizing and community activity that have nothing to do with law at all. I mentioned briefly in my remarks community land trusts as a vehicle that communities have used in areas where there are rising property values and gentrification that's displacing people to try to reclaim ownership of the land and to seize for themselves and redistribute some of those increases in value to the community that would otherwise be displaced. I think that's an example of a civil vehicle, and one that seems so far removed from the criminal law, but that's really important to hold in mind when thinking in an abolitionist framework.
Thank you for that. So Ray said, my concerns involve civil deprivation of civil and constitutional rights and issues. I don't know, Dami or Dale, if y'all have thoughts around that.
This is around section 1983.
I think you said 80. Let's see.
Deprivation of rights under color of law. So
yep. 86 Hate Crime Act.
Yeah, so when I think of section 1983, I know that it's often used as a mechanism to get money for the victims of police violence, or I think in some ways that makes sense. Unfortunately, sometimes what happens as a result of that litigation is that it's individualized. And so we have, the city of Chicago paying out tons of money either through litigation or through settlement agreements to pay off people as a result of being victims. And if those people aren't organizing, then it's just gonna be, the state is willing to just keep paying out that money instead of changing. Yeah, I think if it was tied to like aims of changing police culture that reduces or mitigates harm, then I think that, you know, that could be a viable option. So I'm trying to think of like Tennessee v. Garner as like an example. So Tennessee v. Garner, you know, it gives us, you can't basically shoot someone who's running away, a fleeing felon in the back, if he's not going to be a cause, if he's no longer, he or she no longer a threat of danger to like the officer or to a community. So like we have that, but we also still have police officers shooting people in the back. And so the limitations of civil law is that even when the courts are trying to give you an inch, they're trying to basically say that there are ways that police officers should conduct themselves, and then there are areas beyond that. And unfortunately, police power and the ways that police can be, you know, be violent is expansive. It's expanding. And so even if you are, you know, in that gap where this police officer behave even much more violently than a police officer normally behaves, you have to make that case. And then part of making that case, you have to legitimize that there is a norm of how police officers should behave. So then what happens is that it drives the conversation to get police officers to be more benevolent, right? And rather than reducing the amount of power they have. So we can have nicer cops who can still like shoot you. And then your civil remedy over time is going to continue to shrink because cops now have more and more and more power to act violently within the Constitution.
Thank you so much for that. So the last question we have is from Julia, which is an amazing question. Is around two questions, but around in the immigrants' rights movement, how folks feel about the call to abolish ICE. Is this an opportunity or are we getting something wrong? And super excited for this question. We actually, Stephanie from Mejente was supposed to be on to also discuss this, and I'm sorry she couldn't make it, but would love to hear folks' thoughts about that and its connection to different abolition movements. Who wants to go first? Allegra, do you want to speak on that, or Dami and Deoka? Oh, you're on mute, Allegra.
I can say something really quick. So I think the call to abolish ICE could clearly mean just an effort to eliminate Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which is an agency that was created relatively recently by the Bush administration, and to revert to something that really isn't so different from the current administration of immigration enforcement. But I also think there are many activists that have embraced the call to abolish ICE that have called, for example, as I noted, Harsha Walia's important work for undoing border imperialism. And I think that project is in line with an abolitionist vision, that it is about confronting policing, surveillance, and caging, and eliminating them in the immigration space and more broadly. I don't know if others have thoughts that they wanted to share. My computer keeps cutting in and out. My connection keeps cutting in and out.
We got that. Thank you so much.
Yeah, so one of my friends, Felipe Hernandez, he's entering his second year at Harvard Law School right now. We were having an intense discussion about this, and I think now we're going to co-write something that speaks to that issue of the calls to abolish ICE. And so we've just been surveying the calls across organizers and across politicians, and I think to Allegra's like second half of her point that there are some people who are connecting it to, you know, broader issues. And there are some people who definitely are trying to do a reversion to what we had before. And so there are people, Republicans, who are calling, you know, and I'm not super sympathetic to Democrats for the point I'm about to say now, but there are Republicans who are calling for an end to mass incarceration just so they can invest in companies that's going to surveil people in their homes. Right? So if calls to abolish ICE is going to lead to another system that Rachel was warning us about that we're going to have to fight to tear down, then we should be mindful of that, right? We should be mindful of whenever, you know, people who are benefiting from their position in empire are bending down and picking up terms from movements, right? So there's more of an anti-ICE call you know, and people are rooting that, and they're separated, you know, families from their children, you know, which is true, but we also have police officers who are separated families from their children. You know, Mariam Kaba talks about that, like very, very beautifully. We have that. And so if we think about calls to abolish ICE in isolation or not connected to, you know, broader issues of, you know, protecting imperialist borders or capitalism or shifting and maintenance of wealth, then I think the calls to abolish ICE is just going to co-opt that term. What I do love, though, and also to Rachel's point, is that it could potentially push people who are on fringe, you know, to think more critically or think more deeply about what abolition can mean more broadly. So when Donald Trump tweeted after the calls to abolish ICE went out, he tweeted, you know, first is ICE, next is the police. And I was like, damn straight, like Donald Trump gets it, maybe other people can get it too. And so I find that there's this opportunity to potentially catch people and push people to become more radical and further to the left, and make the call for abolition much more broad.
Thank you. Oh, go ahead.
I mean, I would just add that like ICE is maybe a stand-in for a bigger idea. There's this really great video that I saw maybe a few years ago. I think it was Phil Torrey who taught immigration. If there's every video of like the INS, the Immigration Naturalization Services, before like 2005 or whenever, maybe 2004 is when ICE existed, but like before 2000, I mean, every advertisement, every commercial shows like, you know, people helping people. You see like what immigration is supposed to be. It's like, oh, we are bringing people into the country. It's people helping. It's friendly. It's helping hand. You know, there's video of like, you know, filling out paperwork and documents. And then there's a drastic turn sometime in the like mid to late 2000s where every video of ICE is just like police jumping out of squad cars and helicopters and ATVs on the border. And it's just like the penal logic has infiltrated ICE besides infiltrates other things. And so like, I mean, abolishing ICE doesn't mean anything, and reverting back to something that's called the INS doesn't mean anything if the logic persists and underlies it. And that's the same thing with like, you know, everything we've been talking about here so far. And if I get that video, I'll send it around. I'll send it to Margaret.
Yes. Dope. And I love that what y'all just said was like a amen of what Jess and Julie in the comments said. There's also some dope articles that folks link to around Abolish ICE and BYP and other folks. So check out the comments. That is it. We're out of time. I want to thank you all so much for your insights and your thoughtfulness, and thank everyone who hopped on for the comments. We're going to send out a resource list that'll be on our website time tomorrow evening, probably, with some great pieces by the folks on this call, as well as some of the pieces that folks just sent to us around this conversation. So thank you all again so much for being on. Please check out lawforblacklives.org for more information, and check us out next month around how we can work with and build with folks who are on the inside to form a comprehensive movement. So thank y'all again. Talk to y'all soon.